Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the amendment being proposed to the legislation before us. But like the presenters before me, Mr. Speaker, permit me to preface my very brief contribution with expressions of gratitude to, first of all, the leadership of the St. Lucia Labour Party for having placed their confidence in me as a candidate to contest the general elections of 2021. I also want to say thanks, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister for placing his confidence in my ability to be a member of his cabinet and entrusting me with very important portfolios in the scheme of national development. And I also want to place on the record how grateful I am to the people of Dennery North, Mr. Speaker, who have gone to the polls on 3 different occasions to repose their confidence in my ability to be their parliamentary rep and to give expression to their concerns as beloved constituents. Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank my mother and my family. I want to thank my neighbors. I want to thank my constituency group in Dennery North for the support that they have given to me over the years. Mr. Speaker, today we celebrate 1 year in government after the last general election. And this, Mr. Speaker, is the most coveted, the most cherished, and arguably the most important for me. And you know why, Mr. Speaker? When I look back at the campaign that we ran in 2020, 2021, Mr. Speaker, the onslaught, the nastiness that was thrown in my direction, Mr. Speaker, and with the help of the people of Dennery North and my colleagues, we were able to rise above that, Mr. Speaker. And for me to be able to stand here today and participate in the parliamentary discourse on behalf of the people of Dennery North, Mr. Speaker, I feel a sense of vindication, and so I must thank the people of Dennery North, Mr. Speaker. There was not much fanfare in our campaign, Mr. Speaker. We were guided by a very simple, unambiguous mantra, Mr. Speaker: Shawn again. And Mr. Speaker, I am extremely grateful, as I would have said, to be part of this cabinet. Mr. Speaker, I support the legislation as presented by the Prime Minister. Gun control, Mr. Speaker, has been a concept that has generated a lot of debate, not just in St. Lucia originally, but throughout the world. But today we focus on the situation as it affects our country. Mr. Speaker, every week, every month, we hear the horror stories, how firearms, illegal firearms, are being used in this country to unleash on people who otherwise, Mr. Speaker, cannot defend themselves, and in some cases, Mr. Speaker, those who probably have the capacity to defend themselves, by the time the situation confronts them, it is already too late, Mr. Speaker, and funerals are being planned for them. Mr. Speaker, strengthening the legislation will not solve all the firearm problems and the crime situation we have in the country at the moment. But this represents a very significant step in ameliorating the situation in country today. And as a government, we will never cower. We will never, Mr. Speaker, move away from the reality and admit that there is a gun violence problem in this country. We are not the government to dig our heads like the ostrich in the sand and pretend everything is okay. Mr. Speaker, all of us on this side, we cringe, we hurt when we watch the news and we hear the horror stories, how young men in particular in this country are turning on each other with firearms that are not legal, Mr. Speaker, to solve their disputes. And as I said, strengthening the legislation on its own will not solve the problem, but it represents a significant step in ameliorating the situation. This has to be complemented, Mr. Speaker, by deliberate and targeted social interventions. Crime is a social construct. It is a mindset more often than not. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, when a St. Lucia Labour Party government can give expression and put on the front burner programs like STEP and smiles. And people want to reduce that to interventions that are supposed to appease mendicants and the poor people, Mr. Speaker. It is because they do not understand, Mr. Speaker, the extent to which, as simple as they may be, these programs go in trying to create an environment for people who otherwise, Mr. Speaker, cannot fend for themselves. And so, Mr. Speaker, I support the legislation as presented. The penalties for gun violence and possession have been made more stringent, and we are hoping, Mr. Speaker, that will serve as a deterrent to those individuals or the people in our society who believe, Mr. Speaker, they can disregard law and order, take matters into their hands, and by so doing, they instill fear in the population, and even further afield, Mr. Speaker, they do untold damage to the reputation of our country. Mr. Speaker, je dis ça en créole. Je veux dire que je vais supporter ça Premier ministre Vénitia et puis bon matin, que nous avons fait changement en loi qui a fait plus difficile pour les gens qui joignent fusil et nous avons mis en place des gens qui ont servi fusil sans licence pour tuer les gens, pour menacer les gens, et puis comme ça, Mr. Speaker, que les lois de ces gens là, loi qui traite ces gens en une manière que ici posé faire les gens qui ne kachil pour ni fusil ou pas ni licence pour yo tirer kachil ça, Mr. Speaker, because you savent that punition yo kay joindre c'est kay yon qui kay soyer en pile. Moi aussi dit, Mr. Speaker, that oui, je vais supporter pour nous mettre ces bagages là en place, mais là on met la loi 9 là qui fait plus fort et puis fait plus difficile pour les jeunes fusil et puis pour servir fusil, ça seulement par kay ou abattre et puis mener solution pour situation crime nous dans pays. Et nous besoin en anglais nous créer social programs, bagages qu'on step où des gens qui passent avec des koyo et puis bagages comme ça et ça fait cette ici en place qui primaire pour nous tous. So Mr. Speaker, with this very brief intervention, I want to pledge my support to the Firearms Amendment Bill, and I'm hoping that the desired results and effects, Mr. Speaker, will be there for all of St. Lucia to benefit from, in particular the people of Denrinoff and the young men in this society who have, Mr. Speaker, for a long time now been the subjects of the violence, the perpetrators of the violence that we have seen as it relates to the illegal use of firearms in this country. This does not solve the problem in its entirety, but as I repeat, Mr. Speaker, it is a step in the right direction, and it is only after we come together, government, opposition, civil society organizations, and all patriots of this country, that we can have a constructive conversation to chart a way forward to deal with acts of criminality in our society. Mr. Speaker, we are leaders, we were elected as leaders, and we have to demonstrate leadership when our country calls us, Mr. Speaker, to stand up and support what is right. And so, Mr. Speaker, I support the legislation as presented by the Honorable Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.